Trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence, as stated by Dr. Peter Levine, founder of the Somatic Experience Trauma Institute. Now, we all have histories of trauma, ranging from our ancestors to ourselves. All of us at some point will experience trauma in the future or might have already experienced trauma in the past. And as a college student who studied childhood development and psychology, I have knowledge on how trauma is a cognitive and behavioral issue, which left untreated can result to low quality of life and strained relationships. It's for that reason I want to educate you on intergenerational trauma to give you a clear understanding on how our history and culture not only impacts our own health and behaviors, but how it can impact the health and behaviors of generations after us. With that said, today I will be informing you on the cycle of intergenerational trauma, mainly how it develops in an individual, how it impacts future generations, and current treatments being done to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. To start with, what is intergenerational trauma and how does it develop in an individual? So trauma is the negative cognitive and behavioral developments in response to difficult or adverse life experiences. Whereas intergenerational trauma, as defined by Hill in her article, 6 Ways Intergenerational Trauma Affects Families, is defined as transmitted trauma to younger generations due to the oppressive effects of an event. These can include domestic violence, sexual assault, addiction, and historical trauma such as racism. A case study conducted in 2015 by Benzo and Maggie from the Journal of Social Science and Medicines on Soviet Ukrainians showed how communities with historical trauma have a higher probability of intergenerational trauma. In the studies, 3 generations of Soviet Ukrainians were observed, 3 generations of Soviet Ukrainians whose families lived through the Holodomor, which was the mass starvation of Soviet Ukrainians from 1932 to 33, were observed. And results shows that they exhibited risky behaviors, high levels of anxiety, and strict authoritative parenting styles. This shows how trauma can lead to increasing toxic stress, and if left untreated, can lead to long-lasting neurological damages. Dr. De Silva, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, says that some ways that trauma can manifest in an individual include anxiety, depression, or low self-esteem issues. And overall, this can lead to a greater risk in engaging in unhealthy behaviors, such as high rates of incarceration, addiction, poor mental health, or self-harm. Now that you're aware of how intergenerational trauma impacts an individual, I want to discuss its effects on a larger scale and how it impacts future generations. So trauma is passed down essentially in 2 ways. It can manifest in changes in gene expression and learned behavior. As you can see from this visual aid. Oops, okay. Yeah, as you can see from this visual aid, trauma can be passed down through the changes in expression in genes and development of negative learned behavior. So epigenetics is a study of how and why genes are expressed. And Erdely, in their article, Can Trauma Be Passed Down from One Generation to Another, states that trauma impacts what genes in are turned on and off. And as you can see from this visual aid, that communities with historical trauma, such as surviving European wars, histories of slavery and racism or oppression, can manifest their trauma through the expressions of genes, such as and learned behaviors such as PTSD, alcoholism, and all that, and how it impacts and passes down to their children and their children's children. Oops. Furthermore, this is also supported by a case study conducted by Dr. Rachel Hayuda in 2015, who is the director of the Traumatic Stress Division at Eakin School of Medicine on the children of Holocaust survivors. In her study, she found that there are changes in genes linked to cortisol levels, which are used in response to stress. Additionally, research from the Child Welfare Government shows that trauma can lead to changes in brain structure and brain function, such as delayed learning, difficulty relaying speech, and attention deficits, to name a few. Another major way that trauma can impact future generations is through the development of negative learned behavior, such as when parents normalize, deny, or minimize their trauma as a means of coping. This can be detrimental to future generations, as stated by Hill, as it can lead to future generations struggling with understanding and expressing their own emotions. Furthermore, this can lead to strained parent and child relationships and even abuse, psychological, emotional, or even physical abuse. A personal testimony from Laverne Daisy Miller on how foster care had impacted her and her mother's relationship is an example of this. As Miller stated, that foster care had impacted their relationship in a way that their mother lacked boundaries. Their mother was heavily involved in their personal life, and that their identity was tied with their success and failures. And this only several ways on how parents' trauma can manifest itself onto their children. And what happens is that these behaviors are essentially passed down from each generation to the next, creating an endless cycle of intergenerational trauma. As you can see, that this is a very dangerous and detrimental cycle. But thankfully, due to innovations in psychology and medicine, there are treatments now being made to help understand the importance of understanding and treating intergenerational trauma to increase overall health and quality of life for the current and future generations. These majorly include the use of public education, such as educating public on the importance and impacts of intergenerational trauma, and even professionally training frontline workers to minimize the consequences of intergenerational trauma. Another way that intergenerational trauma is being treated is through the use of family therapies. Specifically, there's one therapy called the internal family therapies, which is a type of self-therapy that's designed by Dr. Richard Schwartz, which is used to help families coping through trauma by helping them understand their trauma and helping them develop self-coping mechanisms to build resilience. To conclude today, I talked about what intergenerational trauma is, how it develops, how it impacts future generations, and what treatments are currently being done to break its cycle. Understanding intergenerational trauma is very significant, as it can lead to cognitive and behavioral changes, which, if left untreated, can also result in a cycle of disruptive behaviors, strained relationships, and even biological damages within a family and the community. Now, the National Council for Behavioral Health states that 70% of adults and 33% of youths experience trauma in their life. Trauma is a very complex process to understand, and even more complex and difficult process to break through from. But with self-knowledge really comes strength, and with strength comes healing. With that said, trauma does not start with us, but it can end with us. Thank you.